Psalm 83 this morning. This is the final Psalm of Asaph in this series of Psalms that we've been going through. We are still going to stay in the Leviticus section in Psalms 84 through 89. Remember, in the Leviticus section of the book of Psalms, the sanctuary is in view. The word congregation or assembly is used in almost every single psalm. And it is the darkness and the dawn for the nation of Israel. Psalm 83, beginning in verse 1. Before we begin in verse 1, the title is a song or psalm of Asaph. Now, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Keep not thou silence, O God, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent, they are confederate against thee. The tabernacles of Edom, and the Ishmaelites of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Gebal, and Ammon, and Amalek, and the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre, Asher also is joined with them. They have holpen the children of Lot. Selah. Do unto them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera, as to Jabin at the brook of Kison, which perished at Endor. They became as dung for the earth. Make their nobles like Oreb and like Zeeb, yea, all their princes as Zebah and as Zalmunna, who said, Let us take to ourselves the houses of God in possession. O my God, make them like a wheel, as the stubble before the wind. As the fire burneth a wood, and as the flame setteth the mountains on fire, so persecute them with thy tempest, and make them afraid with thy storm. Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek thy name, O Lord. Let them be confounded and troubled forever, yea, let them be put to shame and perish. That men may know that thou, whose name alone is Jehovah, art the Most High over all the earth." So, in this psalm, we see a theme of the children of Israel being beset, and then the psalm ends with an imprecatory prayer against the enemies of Israel. Now that word imprecatory, we talked about that before. That means to pray against someone. And we talked about how in the church age, for a Christian, one of the things we ought to be praying for, in fact, maybe the most important thing we ought to be praying for, is for the salvation of the lost. It is not in a Christian's toolkit to pray an imprecatory prayer against anybody. That's not what we ought to be doing. That's not what our goal is. That's not why we're here on this earth. Now, God dealt with Israel as a nation, and he dealt with them differently than he does with individuals. Remember, we've discussed this, that God deals with nations in different ways than he deals with individuals. Nations have a different rule set than individuals. And Israel as a nation, as God's chosen people, as his people who are supposed to be following him, who are supposed to be conducting a dual mission on earth. One of those missions is to be the light of the world. They are supposed to be the light that points forward to the coming Messiah. And they are also supposed to be a righteous example for God. And as a nation, as God's chosen nation with his authority, whenever he grants it, they are supposed to follow his will and execute judgment on those around them. It's very different from what our role is as a Christian. There's no role that we're given as a Christian individual in order to execute judgment upon anybody. Now, that doesn't mean we don't exercise judgment and we don't exercise prudence and wisdom and diligence. Obviously, we have to use judgment in our day-to-day lives, but we are not to be like the Pharisees. We're not to claim any position over anybody else and stare down our noses at anyone else. That's not what our role is. And so this is not a prayer for us to pray, but it is a prayer for the people of Israel to pray. And so it says in verse 1, "Keep not thou silence, O God, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God, for lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head." And so these two verses here give the idea and put us paint the picture that Israel is in trouble, and up to this point, God has not taken them out of the trouble. God has not delivered them from it. They're still in it. And so it's a call to action. It's a prayer of supplication, asking God for something on their own behalf. And they appeal to God. They don't just say, our enemies are running amok, our enemies are causing us problems. They say, for lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. Israel here is being, in this psalm, Asaph is putting Israel together with God, saying, well, our enemies are your enemies. They hate us, that means they hate you. In verse 3 it says, they have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. And so it is always interesting to read this, this psalm, roughly 2,500 years old, older than 2,500 plus, more probably closer to 2,800 years old. And what does it say here? The enemies of Israel, it says, they have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. And you fast forward to today, and there are still people with that same goal, still people with that same mission. The mission to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. It says in verse 5, for they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. And this doesn't just mean that these nations are, all just exercising their own independent national goals that just happen to align against Israel. They are confederate. They're joined. They're together, united. They are all serving a common purpose that isn't just a coincidence. We're going to go through and we'll see these nations that are confederate against them. It says in verse 6, the tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites, of Moab and the Hagarenes, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. Asher also is joined with them. They have hope in the children of Lot. Selah. Now, I'm not going to go through in great detail every single one of these. We're going to hit a few of them. Edom, that one should be very, very familiar to us. The Edomites lived to the south of the Dead Sea in the mountain range of Seir. Sometimes you'll see that in the Bible just referred to as Seir, S-E-I-R. Sometimes you'll see it as Mount Seir. It's referring to that mountain range that's to the south of there. It's close to the area where Sodom and Gomorrah would have been situated. And that's where Esau's progeny, that's where they set up camp. That's where they began to dwell. And they appointed themselves dukes. And they gave themselves titles, and they took control of that mountain range, and that belonged to them. The Ishmaelites, we know who those are. Abraham had a son with his legitimate wife, Sarah. His name was Isaac. Before he had Isaac, at Sarah's behest, he had a son named Ishmael with a concubine, Sarah's maidservant, named Hagar from Egypt. And so Ishmael is the progenitor of the Ishmaelites. For simplicity's sake, Arabs in general. And so basically those that dwell in the Arabian Peninsula, modern day Saudi Arabia, Yemen, those countries in that region there. They were desert dwellers. They were the word escapes me, but they followed their herds, nomads. They were nomadic tribes. Of Moab, we're going to take Moab and we're going to add Ammon in there. Ammon is mentioned in verse 7. Moab and Ammon, those are the names of the two sons of Lot. Now, when Lot left the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, he didn't have any sons. He had a wife and he had a couple of daughters. And we're not going to go read the whole story in Genesis. We know what happened to his wife. They were told not to turn around. They were told not to look back. And his wife, presumably a native or somebody who was from around the lands of Sodom and Gomorrah, not somebody who was brought from the land of Ur, where Abraham and Lot were from, most likely she turned to look at her homeland, and when she did, she turned to a pillar of salt. She disobeyed. Lot and his daughters escaped into the mountains, and there his daughters came up with an idea that apparently in the other cities around, apparently there was no man for them to find for their husband. Those cities had the same problem that Sodom and Gomorrah had, where the men weren't interested in the women, they were only interested in the other men. And so they said to themselves, well, we're not going to be able to have any children. So what they did is they got their father drunk, and they committed a great heinous act. And from that heinous act, while Lot was drunk, were born his sons Moab and Ammon from his daughters. And those two individuals went on to become the progenitors of the Moabites and the Ammonites that lived on the east side of the Jordan River. That is today, modern day Jordan. Then there's the Hagarenes. We're not going to go into great detail on the Hagarenes. If you look in 1 Chronicles, there's a history of the Israelites fighting the Hagarites while Saul was king. Most likely these are the same people. They lived east they were a people who lived east of the Jordan River that were in conflict with the tribe of Reuben. Remember, the tribe of Reuben did not cross into the promised land. They thought, hey, this land's good on the east side of the Jordan River, and they said, how about we just take this? And so they settled on the east side of the Jordan River. Their inheritance is not on the west side. Gebel, again, these are another enemy of Israel, which they fought. We've already talked about Ammon. Amalek, the Amalekites were a big problem earlier on for Israel as opposed to later on. But they are, again, a generational enemy of Israel. The Philistines, says, with the inhabitants of Tyre. The Philistines are those that inhabited what is today the Gaza Strip, and a little bit of the area outside of the Gaza Strip. Philistines, that's where the word Palestine comes from. The Romans, whenever they took over the province, as they called it, of Judea, they wanted to give it a different name and refer to it as a different name so that way they could basically just upset the Jews that lived there. That was really the whole reason. They just wanted to get a jab at them. And so they named the land Palestine after one of their most rugged, one of their worst, one of their longest standing enemies, the Philistines. Remember, the Philistines, these are individuals that Saul fought against, David fought against them, Goliath was a Philistine, and the Philistines had given trouble to the Israelites long before Saul and David ever became kings. The Philistines were a continual thorn in Israel's side. In fact, at one point in time, they actually, during the times of the judges, the Philistines exercised control over Israel and treated Israel like a vassal state. They had basically conquered it and held them in bondage. And so that is the kind of enemy that the Philistines were, along with the inhabitants of Tyre. Tyre is a coastal city that's in northern Israel, around the Israeli Lebanese border there. Tyre, that's where it's situated. It was a main city of the Phoenicians, which are the probably the most well-known tribe of the Canaanite peoples. And so these are Canaanites. And we know the Canaanites are those that inhabited the land of Canaan. They are the ones who inhabited the land before Israel came and conquered it. And so, not only this, these are just all the people that are around the border. So we basically covered all the bordering nations. Then we also have, Asher also is joined with them. They have Holpen, the children of Lot. Asher is a name of, and it's a name that refers to the king of Assyria. Assyria, at the time, was basically, other than Israel, the biggest, baddest, fightingest, meanest nation in the Middle East. I mean, they were the worst enemy you could possibly make. They were a nation that thrived, and thrived only upon military conquest. That is how they survived. That's how they kept themselves going. They conquered more, and they conquered more, and they conquered more. That's what kept their nation going. When they stopped being able to conquer is when they began to decline. And then when they began to decline, they became conquered. And that was the end of it. The Babylonians took them over. But, as I mentioned, this is a force to be reckoned with. So they've got all of these bordering people surrounding them. Everybody within close proximity hates them. Absolutely. There's no friendships to be made. There's nothing they can do. There's nobody that wants to be partners. There's nobody that wants to join with them. They are surrounded. And then not only that, but there's help coming from further away for the enemies. What is the difference? And we're not going to go into modern events too much. But it seems to me that there's not much difference between 2,800 years ago, 2,900 years ago, 2,700 years ago, whatever date you want to put on it, and the year 2025. It seems to me that everybody on Israel's border has the same goal, the same inclination, the same desire. It seems to me that the same situation is going on, that everybody around them is against them, and they're trying to get help from nations further away. And so I would say that this psalm, especially since while the time Asaph was writing, either David or Solomon would have been the king. He's bringing up a lot of Israel's history. We know he's very educated about Israel's history. And we'll see that here shortly when we go through verses 9 through 11. But Asaph here is a psalmist in a time of peace. When Asaph was writing, either David was conquering and Israel was winning while David was king, or Solomon was king and they had peace. because David had conquered everybody. And so the tumult that Asaph speaks of is not a tumult that occurred during his specific lifetime. I believe that this is a prophetic psalm. It's a psalm that refers to future events. This is there's not much local application for it. Now in verse 9 it says, "Do unto them." And so here we reach the imprecatory prayer. We've seen the framing in verses 1 through 8. In verse 9 it says, "Do unto them." Okay. "Do unto them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera, as to Jabin at the brook of Kison, which perished at Endor, they became as dung for the earth." Okay. So, we're not going to go and read all of the events, but this is referring to events in Judges 4 and 5 that is regarding the judge, the supposed to be judge, Barak, whichever way you want to pronounce it, Barak. And he was supposed to lead 10,000 of Israel's men into battle against Israel's enemies, and he refused. And God called upon the prophetess Deborah, and she came, and Barak said, essentially, well, if you go, I'll go, but if you don't go, I'm not going to listen to God. That was essentially the kind of man Barak was. And so their enemies were Sisera and Jabin. Sisera is a title that refers and name that refers to the leader there of the Midianites, and Jabin is the name there of the king. And they were at the brook of Kison. This was the event that occurred shortly before that final defeat of the actual king. The king was he sort of stayed back for the most point and let these generals do most of the work here, which is common among kings at that time. Saul did that for much of the time he was king. At the end of his career, or leading to the end of his career, if you want to call it a career, David did that. He stopped going out to battle at a certain age and started staying in the palace. And so that's what the King Jael did. And so that is referring to the story of Deborah and Barak. And then in verse 11, we skip forward a few chapters in the book of Judges to Judges chapter 7 and Judges chapter 8. It says, "Make their nobles like Oreb and like Zeeb, yea, all their princes as Zebah and as Zalmunna." Make their nobles like Oreb and like Zeeb. Now we will read a little bit of this. We're not going to read the entire story. We'd be here for a very long time if we did. But we're going to turn to the very end of Judges chapter 7. And this is during the judgeship of Gideon. Judges chapter 7, very end of the chapter. We'll start in verse 22, and we'll read through verse 25. It says, "And the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And the host fled to Bethshittah in Zererath, and to the border of Abel-Meholah unto Tabbath. And the men of Israel gathered themselves together out of Naphtali, and out of Asher, and out of all Manasseh, and pursued after the Midianites. And Gideon sent messengers throughout all Mount Ephraim, saying, Come down against the Midianites, and take before them the waters unto Bethbara and Jordan. Then all the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together, and took the waters unto Bethbara and Jordan. And they took the 2 princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeeb, and they slew Oreb upon the rock Oreb, and Zeeb they slew at the winepress of Zeeb, and pursued Midian, and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeeb to Gideon on the other side Jordan." So these men, Oreb and Zeeb, are 2 princes, they're 2 rulers within Midian. And they were slew at places that were actually named after them. It's called up on the rock Oreb and the winepress of Zeeb. They're named that because that's where they died. And so that is what happened to the enemies here. They were slain by the Ephraimites. It says in verse 1 in chapter 8, "And the men of Ephraim said unto him, Why hast thou served us thus, that thou callest us not when thou wentest to fight with the Midianites? And they did chide with him sharply. And he said unto them, What have I done now in comparison of you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God hath delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeeb, and what was I able to do in comparison of you? Then their anger was abated toward him when he had said that." Now remember, we actually had read a psalm earlier where Ephraim was shown to be a runaway tribe, that they flaked out in the face of battle. That was not Ephraim's whole history, and remember we discussed that. For a long time, Ephraim was a fighting tribe. So much so that they were often in various parts of Scripture, actually the nation Israel was referred to as Ephraim. They were like the leading tribe for the 10 northern tribes for a time. And that comes from their fighting background and their ability to take charge and to lead. And so what happened here is Gideon had his 300 men. Remember, he started with all kinds of people, and God kept whittling it down and whittling it down and whittling it down until he was left with 300. And God did more with those 300 men than men have done with thousands, tens of thousands. But then Gideon calls upon the help of the Ephraimites, and they go to fight, and then when they finally meet with Gideon, they say, "Well, why in the world didn't you get us involved sooner? You know we like to fight. You know this is what we want to do. What took you so long?" And they were mad at him. It says they did chide with him sharply. And Gideon begins to flatter them. He says, "What have I done that's in comparison of anything that you've done?" Inflating their heads a little bit. He says, "Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer?" Basically saying that the little scraps, the little bits of leftovers from Ephraim are better than the greatest of Abiezer. And so it says he kept flattering them, and then at the end of verse 3, "Then their anger was abated toward him when he had said that." And now in the next few verses, it says in verse 4, "And Gideon came to Jordan and passed over, he and the 300 men that were with him, faint yet pursuing them. And he said unto the men of Succoth, Give, I pray you, loaves of bread unto the people that follow me, for they be faint, and I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian. And the princes of Succoth said, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in thine hand, that we should give bread unto thine army? And Gideon said, Therefore, when the Lord hath delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into mine hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. And he went up thence to Penuel, and spake unto them likewise. And the men of Penuel answered as the men of Succoth had answered him. And he spake also unto the men of Penuel, saying, When I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. And so, over the next few verses, verses 10 through 13, Gideon and his men catch up to Zebah and Zalmunna, and they lose. Gideon wins. The kings lose. He takes them. He comes back in verses 14 and 15 and 16 and 17. We see these men of Succoth, and we see the city of Penuel. He comes back. He takes the briars and the thorns to the men of Succoth. It says he teaches them. It says, with them he taught the men of Succoth. So they learned a lesson. And he beat down the tower of Penuel and slew the men of the city. And so they refused to help with God's work. They refused to offer bread to these men who were chasing after the kings. And the reason they did that was out of fear. They thought, well, there's no way this small band of men is going to defeat this army of 10, 15,000 under these Midianites. It's just not going to happen. So they asked, has God already delivered them into your hands? We want to be sure before we go and make enemies of the Midianites here. And Gideon, he shook the dust off his feet, and he said, well, too bad for you. I'll be back. and he went back. Now in verse 18, it says, Then he said unto Zebah and Zalmunna, What manner of men were they whom ye slew at Tabor? And they answered, As thou art, so were they. Each one resembled the children of a king. And he said, They were my brethren, even the sons of my mother, as the Lord liveth. If ye had saved them alive, I would not slay you. And he said unto Jether his firstborn, Up and slay them. But the youth drew not his sword, for he feared, because he was yet a youth. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, Rise thou and fall upon us, for as the man is, so is his strength. And Gideon arose and slew Zebah and Zalmunna, and took away the ornaments that were on their camels' necks. And so that is what happened to Zebah and Zalmunna. So Oreb and Zebah and Zalmunna, the two princes and the two kings, they all were destroyed at the hands of God's judges and God's armies. And that is exactly what Asaph is asking for here in Psalm 83. He's saying, Do unto them, the enemies of God, all those different types of people, all the different nations, all the different people groups, tribes bordering Israel and from afar that are coming against them. He says, Do unto them as you did to the Midianites. Take them out. That's the imprecatory prayer that's being prayed here. It says in verse 11, Make their nobles like Oreb and like Zeeb, yea, and all their princes as Zebah and as Zalmunna, who said, Let us take to ourselves the houses of God in possession. O my God, make them like a wheel, as the stubble before the wind, as the fire burneth the wood, and as the flame setteth the mountains on fire, so persecute them with thy tempest, and make them afraid with thy storm. Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek thy name, O Lord. Now, even in the midst of this imprecatory prayer, I want you to see what Asaph prays for. He prays for great destruction. He prays for great punishment to be brought upon the enemies of God. But he also mentions in verse 16, Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek thy name, O Lord. The point of the prayer is not only to gain victory. It's not only to dispose of the enemies. It's to change the enemies' hearts. It says, Let them be confounded and troubled forever, yea, let them be put to shame and perish, that men may know that thou, whose name alone is Jehovah, art the most high over all the earth. The most important thing that's being prayed for here is not just the victory. It's so that people will understand who God is. They will see his glory. They will understand he is in control. That he is the one who is the Most High. So that is Psalm 83. Are there any comments or questions this morning?